I don't know where my kids will live when they're, educating their own children. But what I do hope is if they're in West Virginia or in another state, I hope that the freedom that they have is greater than the freedom I have now. And I personally have an opportunity potentially to shape the future of home education that my own kids may operate in. And so when I wake up in the morning and you're tired and you go, okay, here's another day, you realize that, there's a whole generation of kids that will benefit from the work that we're doing. And so that's really, to me, you're like, okay, I'll do this another day. I'll do this another week. I'll send out another alert. I'll make another phone call. I'll drive to another meeting. Because the freedom that I want to hand my kids is, I hope, is greater than the one that was handed to me.
Welcome to Homeschool Talks, a podcast by HSLDA. This is a show about all things homeschooling, from practical tips to inspiring stories and everything in between. You can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. We're so glad you've joined us today, and we hope you enjoyed the program. Here's your host, Jim Mason.
Hi, I'm Jim Mason, president of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and this is another episode of Homeschool Talks, where I get to talk to interesting people in the world of homeschooling. Today, I'm talking with HSLDA Senior Counsel, Kevin Boden, who joined HSLDA just about 3 years ago and has been doing some interesting and exciting work since then. And I thought it'd be a good idea for us to kind of check in and see how the last 3 years have gone. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks, Jim.
So let's just go back a little bit. I know we had kind of an introductory episode with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your homeschooling journey.
Yeah, well, we got started homeschooling when our oldest daughter, who's now a college graduate, was in first grade. And we did it somewhat accidentally. I had gotten a job in Europe in law school, and we didn't know what to do with her school. And so actually the private school where she was attending suggested that we just take the books and homeschool her for a second semester of first grade. We did that in our small flat in The Hague, Netherlands, where I was working for the ICTY. And suffice it to say, that's what the Lord used to kind of launch us into the realm of homeschooling. And none of our kids have been in anything other than homeschooling in their elementary and secondary school years.
So I didn't know they had semesters in first grade. Do you have semesters in your homeschool?
That's a little bit more fluid in the homeschool than what they had. So yeah, it was interesting, and it's interesting to see how God engineers circumstances that you can't see at the time. And so I look back at that and go, how interesting that he would have started us on that journey, 17, 18 years ago, maybe, knowing of course that I would be here today doing the job that I do on behalf of homeschoolers and homeschool freedom. So it's just very neat to see the providence of the Lord and all of that.
Now, somewhere along the way, you became a JAG officer in the Air Force.
I did, yeah. So in law school, I was working at a prosecutor's office, and it was kind of an economic downturn time, 2008, 2009. And so I applied for the Air Force JAG Corps and thought, well, I get a chance to try criminal cases. I get a chance to learn trust and estates. I get a chance to do some different stuff, maybe travel the world. And so applied for that. And I was on active duty Air Force for 10 years. First assignment was in Germany, last assignment in Colorado. And loved the time on active duty. I really did.
And then after that, you had some time with the National Guard.
I did. So in 2019, I separated from the active component, joined the reserve component. We moved in 2019 from Peterson, now Space Force Base in Colorado, back up to Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska. And so from 2019 until 2022, when I came here, I was full-time National Guard. And when I came here, I moved from a full-time status and went part-time. And I'm still a part of the Alaska Air National Guard. And I go up there, as you know, almost quarterly and do my drills. And so still very much a part of it, put the uniform on. I still love it.
So how did it come about that you came to work at HSLDA?
It came about in October of 2022. My wife and I had started to serve on the Alaska Private and Home Educators Association board, which is the state organization board for Alaska for independent homeschooling. And if I recall correctly, about 3 days before that conference, I get a text message from my wife, which is, lo and behold, an attorney vacancy announcement for HSLDA. So I looked at it and I'm like, okay, that's interesting. We had just built our home. I think we had moved in maybe 6 months before she sent me this. I mean, we'd spent the last couple of years building it. We just moved in. And I thought, oh, this is interesting, And in Alaska at the time, Dan Beasley had come and was there, was speaking. And I remember I went to the HSLDA booth, and Jen J was there, had a big booth. And I just asked Dan casually, I'm like, hey, I'm curious, my wife sent me this attorney vacancy announcement. Would you take a few minutes and just walk me through what the organization is like and what it's like to work there and what it's like to be an attorney? And so we had a brief conversation there. And then actually the day after the conference that morning, Bethany, his wife, was with him. And so Dan and Bethany and Wendy and I, with all of our kids, went to breakfast at a local diner, and we just chatted for a couple hours about the job. And anyways.
Now, is that the first time or the second time?
First time. Second time of what?
So I think, if I remember right, there was a vacancy earlier than that.
There was a vacancy earlier. So actually, I pulled this email up this morning. In 2020, there was an attorney vacancy posting, and I actually applied for that job. And I think it was October, if my memory serves me correct, where I did receive an email back from one James R. Mason that position had been filled, and you currently were not looking for any other candidates. So that was probably 2.5 years maybe before I applied the second time, then in 2022. So yeah, that was the second time, is the answer to your question.
Yeah. So I have a slightly different but similar story that I wrote to Mike Ferris before I went to law school. And I kind of told him, hey, I've got great news for you. The Lord is calling me to work on behalf of homeschoolers, but first I have to go to law school and, graduate and get a license. But when I finish, I'll be ready. And eventually it came to pass. So it's great to see how the Lord has worked. And what do you do for us? I mean, I have been asking myself this now, for like 3 years. What in the world does Kevin Boden do for HSLDA?
Well, like other attorneys here, I mean, it really depends on the day. I mean, there's a couple core things that we do. We just recently came out of heavy legislative season, where most of the state legislators are open and very active in the first few months of the year. So that really comprises, January through, at least for me in the states that I'm in, kind of late April are the big months. Of course, we always do member contact work. We strive to really serve our members very well with whatever questions they may have. Some fairly straightforward and simple, and some quite complicated, and some, of course, that require court intervention that we, have been known to engage in. And then I'm also blessed to direct our national program and work to kind of expand the boundaries of homeschool freedom across the globe and in the opportunities and capacities that we have to do that.
So you said contact work. Talk about that a little bit more. What is the contact work that HSLDA attorneys do? Yeah,
so, we have... it ranges. And so, a couple of examples would be that I've dealt personally with, hey, we're moving to X state, we're moving from California to Tennessee. What does it look like in homeschool in Tennessee? It could be, hey, my son wants to run track in the spring at the local public school, and I'm running into problems getting him able to participate via the public access statute. It could be, hey, we have to file a notice form, but the superintendent is requiring us to use their particular form, and it asks all of this additional information that's not required by law. What should we do in that situation? Or it could be recently, we had a CPS case where a family called and were visited by Child Protective Services, and they wanted to walk through the home and take pictures and all of these things. And so the family reached out to us, and we walked them through, okay, here's what your rights are under the law. Engaged with the CPS investigator to determine what's the right outcome to resolve the issue. So it's really a very, very varied practice from I'm moving to a state, how do I start homeschooling, to, CPS just left my house and, I'm really scared and I don't know what to do about it.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the busy legislative season that we've had this year. You personally had some pretty good successes, or were involved in some pretty good successes. Talk about those.
Yeah, so the one bill in particular, HB 778 out of Montana, there was a newly elected representative there who reached out to me early in the session and contacted us and said, hey, Kevin, would you be willing to draft a bill? Here's some of the things that I want to do. And of course, as you know, it goes through a lot. Once the initial draft gets sent, it goes to the sponsor and it goes to the bill drafters and reviewers and the attorneys in the legislature. But we had a couple of there was the original bill in Montana was what was in effect from what I think is 1993. And the non-public schools and homeschools were lumped into the same code. And this particular sponsor wanted to separate those a little bit, acknowledge that educational landscape has come a long way in the last 20 plus years. And perhaps having these in the same part of the statute is not as ideal as it was back in the early 90s. So anyway, so I drafted a bill for his review and we discussed it on the phone. And he liked it. It went to the sausage making process, if you will, in the legislature. It came out very similar to what I had drafted and we had agreed was a positive step forward for the bill. And so long story short, it passed unanimously in the House. It passed unanimously in the Senate. It was signed by the governor. In fact, just a couple months ago, I flew out to Montana and Governor Gianforte, who's a strong homeschool supporter, did a bill signing in Lewistown, Montana, which I've been told is the center of Montana. And to confirm that, I even reached out to my Wendy's father, Dwayne. My wife grew up in Montana. So I told him I was going to Lewistown. He's like, oh, that's the center of the state. So it's confirmation of like, okay, people don't just say this, but it's kind of a known Montana lore. But all that to say, that was a big part of the process. And it involved, not just drafting the bill and letting it go, but we actively, ask people to engage with that when we know that it's going to be scheduled for a hearing in the House or the Senate or up for a full chamber vote. We'll put out an alert, ask people to contact their representatives. Representative Brandon Gregg sponsored that bill and just did a great job. Of course, Steve White in Montana has been a longtime homeschool advocate there for decades, really. In fact, he was there back in the early 90s when the original bill was.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit. There was a little bit of deja vu and...
Yeah, so I'm trying to remember what chamber it was. I think it was the original when it was going through the House. I was flying out to Alaska, and by God's providence, the committee meeting was scheduled for the day before I was going up to Alaska. So I said, hey, I'll come out a day early. I'll fly up to Montana. I'll testify in support of this bill. And so we get there and we're sitting in the back, and I'm coming in late. There's all kinds of travel delays, and a pretty miraculous story on just how this all came together at the last minute anyways. But as we're sitting in there, I'm talking to Steve White, and he goes, hey, this is the same room where the bill back in the early 90s was heard when it was going through the chamber. So it was very neat just to connect with a longtime homeschool advocate in the state who had been there at the beginning in the early 90s, who had that continuity and could just shared some of those really interesting tidbits of information that you wouldn't know if you weren't there in the 90s.
Yeah.
And so very, very neat to be a part of that. Again, it's an important step in the history of homeschool freedom in Montana. It's an important step, and I'm hopeful that there'll be additional steps to come.
If I recall, Steve White, remind me of the name of the Montana homeschool group.
Montana Coalition of Home Educators.
Was he there with our founder, Mike Ferris, back in the early 90s?
He was. As a matter of fact, a couple months ago, Steve dug out a photograph of him and Mike Ferris. That's when I think he mentioned it was 93. I could be wrong on that. But yes, Mike Ferris was there, and Steve, both of them, of course, instrumental in the legal change. It was it was a massive shift in the state at the time. And, some of that creates some uncertainty, of should we mess with it or should we just leave it alone? It's kind of one of those, it's worked for 20 years. Do we risk taking some steps backward if we try to make positive improvements? I mean, that's not uncommon for that to happen as soon as you open that section of the code. So there was some concern and some discussions between the sponsor, Steve, and I to say, hey, if we're going to do this, what's the best way to do it to ensure that we make positive steps forward and don't inadvertently open ourselves up towards an increase in regulation from someone who maybe is less prone or less supportive of the practice.
Yeah, I love that story because the continuity that you mentioned, Mike Ferris was instrumental in the early days, and here we are, we're still working to improve the laws in states like Montana, and the continuity and the passing down from one generation to the next is a big part of the work we do, really.
Yeah, it is. I of course was honored to be there and be a part of this small process, and just to know that history has been there and that we continue to do the foundational work that we've been doing for 40 years. I mean, it's, as you know, Jim, I'm a relative newcomer to the movement. A lot of these folks like Steve has been around a long time. a lot of the state leaders I talk to have been laboring most of their lives for this cause. And so to be a part of that rich history and to talk to him, to remember that, was really, really special. And then same thing with the sponsor. I mean, this is a relatively young guy. It's his first time elected to the Montana House. And so for him to take up this cause at the age that he's at and continue to advance the ball forward. I mean, at some point I've said to many people, at some point, our race we'll run around the track and we'll hand the baton to someone else. And I feel like I'm in that position where many have labored, and by God's providence, I've been given a small baton, and, by his grace, I'll run as long as I can. And at some point, we just have to recognize that I'll hand it off to somebody else, and hope that they're in a better position when I hand it to them than it was when I got it. And so that's kind of where we're at.
So there are two things that we do in legislative season. One of them is to try to expand the boundaries of freedom, like you just talked about in Montana. The other is to try to prevent retrenchment by ideological opponents of homeschool freedom. I know you weren't personally involved in a couple of the big cases or big legislative battles, but can you just talk a little bit about some of those, maybe Illinois and Virginia in particular?
Yeah, I mean, there are some who, frankly, don't like homeschooling. They don't like the practice. They think it should be in a totally different legal framework in our country. And there are people in the movement that maybe don't want to acknowledge that and just assume that everyone has this goodwill towards it or they support it. And we found this year in a very practical kind of street level sense that that's not the case. There was, I think, SB 31 in Virginia that would have removed this religious exemption from compulsory public school attendance. Kind of a surprise bill, as I understood it. It's not one of these bills that we had knowledge of or saw coming. It kind of came out of nowhere. And again, Scott Woodruff was just instrumental in leading the charge and mobilizing a coalition, working with like-minded state leaders here, he and others in the state to push back against a bill ultimately that didn't get a lot of traction. And then 2827 in Illinois was kind of the story of the year in terms of opposition to homeschool freedom with the Homeschool Act. And so really stark reminders that there are, in fact, as we've talked about, ideological opponents to home education. And, it's a bit surprising because when you're in a certain community where most of the people like homeschooling, most of your friends probably homeschool, it's a certain kind of bubble that you walk in, you realize that there's an entirely different bubble out there that has a totally different perspective. And if they have their way, they would create a much different world. Speaking of that baton I mentioned earlier, the baton that they would hand to their kids is one of increase in regulation and more restrictions than we have now. And so we saw that in a major way. Will Estrada I joked with him one week if he had a condo in in Chicago, or, if he had just bought a house there, because he seemed to spend so much time there because the battle was so intense and so fierce. So I think this was a stark reminder. West Virginia, a case that I dealt with, was another, just realizing that there are people, elected officials, that don't like the level of freedom and parental rights and autonomy that many parents enjoy in the country. And so vigilance is always required.
Yeah, and we expect more of the same next legislative season, probably maybe in the same states and maybe others as well.
Yeah, I think so. If we learn nothing else, it's that vigilance is just always required, both for the good and the bad. And West Virginia was an interesting case because it started as a very positive bill and switched about halfway through and become a bill that we couldn't support and had to oppose. So, a bill where you would send out an alert and call members to support, and then a couple weeks later send out another e-alert to the same group of people and say you have to oppose and why, I think just really speaks to the reality that the legislative process can be very dynamic. And there's just not, it's very tiring, to be honest. When you're in the fray, you talk to Will and you talk to Scott and you talk to all of us who were doing this. There's just not, you just don't really rest in those moments. You just have to keep paying attention and keep being attentive to what's going on. And one of the really things that keeps me going is it's really worth it. I look at it and I go, okay, we live in West Virginia. I don't know where my kids will live when they're, educating their own children. But what I do hope is if they're in West Virginia or in another state, I hope that the freedom that they have is greater than the freedom I have now. And I personally have an opportunity potentially to shape the future of home education that my own kids may operate in. And so when I wake up in the morning and you're tired and you go, okay, here's another day, another, set of issues to deal with, you realize that, there's a whole generation of kids that will benefit from the work that we're doing. And so that's really, to me, you're like, okay, I'll do this another day. I'll do this another week. I'll send out another alert. I'll make another phone call. I'll drive to another meeting. Because the freedom that I want to hand my kids is, I hope, is greater than the one that was handed to me. And because of work like HSLDA, the freedom that I got was pretty good. I mean, it was very good. But can we make it even incrementally better for our kids? And I think that's what we labor for.
Yeah, and prevent it from getting worse.
Absolutely.
You mentioned a thing called an alert. What is an alert? Who does it go to, and why are they important?
An e-alert is very simply an electronic alert. It's an email that we send out when there is some type of call to action or important data point that we think needs to be spread to a particular community. So if you're not on our email list in any particular state, I would encourage you to get signed up for those so that you know what's going on. And so, for example, 2827 out of Illinois, when that originally was, introduced, we sent an e-alert. Hey, notify members all across the state. This bill was just introduced. Here's what it does. Here's why we oppose it. And here's what we think you should do, or here's what we're calling you to do. In that case, it's, hey, write witness slips, show up at the Capitol for hearings. They did a handful of press conferences in Chicago. And so the e-alerts is our way of communicating quickly and hopefully effectively to the audience in that particular state, either updating them on a particular thing that's important or often calling them to take a particular action. And we really strive to make those as important as they can be. And really, I mean, so this is the way I think of it. If my wife gets an e-alert from Kevin Boden a Thursday at 3:00 that says, hey, this is critical, drop what you're doing, make a phone call or send an email to your elected official, your representative, here's the members of Senate Education, send an email and tell them that you support this bill or you oppose this bill. I try to think of my wife and I go, okay, if she's at home with our 7 kids at home, homeschooling on a Thursday afternoon, and she gets this bill, is it important enough? Do I think it's important enough for her to stop what she's doing and pay attention to this? And so those are the types of things that we put out on an e-alert. And so we have that in mind. We don't send them out willy-nilly. We try to make them very value added. We send them out when they're important and necessary. And I think if you get those, you'll find that they are actually quite informative and they are quite helpful. And really, they are quite necessary. We need people to show up. We need people to call and be engaged.
Now, in Illinois, there were lots of groups doing similar things, but I think we were probably the longest standing organization and maybe the most active with the most followers. We sent out an e-alert in Illinois asking people to come to the Capitol. Do you remember Will Estrada's story about what happened then?
I don't remember the story. I think I remember some pictures that were...
Well, I remember the story. So many people turned up, thousands, that they had to close access to the Capitol, and hundreds more rallied and sang and prayed outside the Capitol while the bill was being heard. I think estimates were something, on the conservative side, something like 5,000 people. So the reason we do what we do, we track the bills, we analyze the bills, we decide which bills we want to support, which ones we want to oppose. But the work of the grassroots homeschoolers is always so important. So like Kevin said, if you're not already signed up to get our action emails in your state, I'd urge you to do so, because we're going to be facing challenges. We don't know which states, we don't know when they're going to happen exactly. Sometimes we have hints, sometimes we know. But we need you as much as we need to be vigilant ourselves.
And I think it's interesting to note on along those lines, some families will ask, well, does it really matter? I'm one family, I'm one person, I'm one phone call, I'm one email. And it really is the cumulative effect of that. When you show up in the thousands, it's highly unlikely that even most of those would be heard or have an opportunity to speak, but it's the volume of people who were there which sends a message to the elected officials. So I just really encourage people, because sometimes, again, if you're a homeschool parent and you're in the middle of your homeschool year, I mean, we're talking February, March. I mean, most families are just in the thick of homeschooling at that moment. And so, but the participation in the democratic process to show up and be a part of that, I just think is critical. And I can't overstate enough, as you just said, Jim, that it really is the constituents on the ground who show up that make the difference. I mean, elected officials, they want to know what the people in that state have to say. And when you show up in the numbers as they did in Illinois, it sends a really strong message that's pretty hard to ignore for most representatives.
Another thing that we'd really like to encourage is for families to become acquainted with your elected officials outside of a crisis moment or in a time when your voice needs to be heard. Most states, Illinois did it for years without, before this bill was introduced. Most states host some kind of a rally at their state capitol where homeschool families come in and just go around and meet their representatives. In Tennessee, they pass out. Gosh, I was there a couple of years ago. They invite legislators in for lunch and then they take them cookies. In Idaho, it's apple pie day, but it's kind of always the same thing in the really sincere belief that the most influential representative for an elected official is an active, caring homeschool family. So homeschool families with their kids go and visit their representatives, and that leaves a positive, favorable impression for later when the crisis comes.
Absolutely. It's, I've been blessed as you have to speak at many of these Capitol days and see the families that come out and really let people know this is the community that they are serving. And so when something like Illinois comes up and there's all of this press about, oh, this is the homeschool community and this is what they do and this is why we have to regulate them and this is what they're about. And, the hope is that a representative would read that and see that narrative and say, well, that's actually really inconsistent with my own personal experience with this community. And a Capitol is a great way to do that, where they can recall and say, well, no, this is actually a group that brought us lunch. This is a group that was very polite. This is a group that cared enough to show up at the Capitol. They visited me. I know some states, they'll even, South Dakota does this. And I just thought it was a great idea. I mean, you can sponsor a representative's meal. And so they'll put a personal invitation in the representative's box, invite them to lunch and just say, hey, here's the names of the homeschool families that have contributed so that you can enjoy this lunch today. I mean, put a name with the invitation, and then you can meet that family as they come down to the rotunda to eat. So lots of different neat ideas around the country, but the foundational principle is to build those relationships over time and really demonstrate what the true community looks like, which is generally a very loving, very caring community.
Well, let's move on to what's the rest of your year look like as an HSLDA attorney? You said legislative season is really heavy, kind of front-loaded at the beginning of the year. We're recording this just before the 4th of July, which is kind of a little bit of a lull time in our activity level. What comes next? What comes next for us is a pretty busy member contact season as we move into the upcoming school year. And so some people ask, well, why is it so early? I mean, I'm personally just flabbergasted at how early schools start anymore. I remember it was a post-Labor Day start. I mean, almost, that's what I remember is that was the final weekend of your summer freedom. And but a lot of laws have, particularly in the older years as people enter high school, there's requirements that you might have for a notification in a particular state. There's a requirement that you might have if your child wants to participate in public school athletics, and they have to give notice XYZ days before the start of the school year. Otherwise, they don't have the right to participate. And so moving into late July and certainly into August, there's just a lot of contacts, a lot of assistance that, families need that we help resolve. And so I would say from later this month, it is kind of a lull, a little bit more of a lull, certainly than legislative season and busy member contact. So moving into the fall, that's what we'll do. And, I don't know how many
issues we resolve in these months, but I mean, I have to imagine it's thousands and thousands of contacts that we get across the country that we help to resolve.
And as you mentioned, sometimes they're very easy, simple questions. This is the time of year when families new to homeschooling have lots of questions. And sometimes they're pretty complicated and can take a good amount of time for us to figure out and resolve. I never cease to be amazed at how, even today, I've been here for almost 25 years, and once a week, once a month, one of you guys will come in to me with this question that I'm pretty sure you made up because it can't actually happen in real life. It's like a law professor made this up for a law school exam. And it's just, it's a real issue with real people that we have to work out and figure out and help them make their way through.
I mean, I'll give an example of, I think, encouraging, if you're a member, to reach out to us early if there's any question, or if you're not a member, maybe you would consider joining. Is we recently had a case that came out of one state where they had to file a notice for their education, and you had to put down particular sports that you are considering if in whatever the local public school is. And in this particular case, they wrote down a sport and put a question mark and decided to change. I mean, they never actually went through with participating with the school, but the eligibility requirements of the athletic association put them then in a transfer position, and they were precluded from moving to a different education just because they'd put that in their notice form with a question mark. And so all that to say, it can even be kind of surprisingly complicated, or this kind of web of statutes and regulations and activities associations, bylaws and policy documents. And so it was a reminder to me that, when a family has a question, it never hurts to just say, hey, this is what we're thinking about doing. Do you see any issues, or do you have any concerns with this issue, or could this create problems for me down the road? And a lot of it, there's a fair amount of questions we answer that says, hey, yeah, this, because we've had that experience, I could then say, hey, yeah, you're better off to just put nothing than to try to be kind and tell them what you think you might do. And so it's a good example, to me, of reach out early. And those are the types of questions that we resolve. And even if you're not quite sure what the question is, raise the issue, and often we can help clarify what the legal issue is, and then help resolve the issue that's actually manifested itself.
Well, Kevin, thanks for joining me today. Is there anything else for the good of the order you'd like to tell homeschool families out there?
The only thing that I'll close on is we've talked about, legislative season and, the freedom we have to homeschool. I mean, I'm constantly amazed at the freedoms we have in this country. And, when I look across the world and I talk to lots of families that just have a lot of problems, we deal with a lot of stuff. I mean, as we've talked about, we resolve a lot of issues on behalf of homeschool families. But by and large, I'm just grateful that the freedoms that we enjoy in this country are so great. And I always walk away, at least I try to walk away with gratitude, saying, hey, for everything that we deal with, for all the frustrations that I know families have to go through, there's a lot of freedoms that they still have, even amidst some of the challenges that they face. I'm just really grateful for the state orgs that have labored for years, thankful to HSLDA for the decades of labor, and just for people in the country that have, the homeschool mom and dad that have shown up at the Capitol over the last 40 years and made phone calls. I mean, I think we've yielded lots of fruit, and the freedoms that we have in this country are really unparalleled across the world, and I'm just real grateful for that.
Well, that's a great ending note. And as I said earlier, we are recording this 2 days before the 4th of July. And so life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, one expression of that liberty is the freedom to homeschool our kids according to our own values and beliefs. And that's why we're here, to help you do that. We do live in a great country, Kevin, and thank you for joining me today. And if you are not currently a member of HSLDA, after hearing this stirring testimony by my colleague here, Kevin Boden, won't you consider joining and even perhaps donating to our cause? And you can find out more about what we do at hslda.org. So once again, I'm Jim Mason, president of Homeschool Legal Defense Association. Thanks for joining us today.
Every week, HSLDA hears from hundreds of homeschool families, many of whom are facing hostility from school officials or discrimination from colleges and employers. We've helped single parents facing criminal charges for homeschooling their children, families traumatized by wrongful CPS investigations, and even a grandmother harassed by the state for homeschooling her granddaughter. By donating to HSLDA, you can help make homeschooling possible for families like these and enable our work to preserve freedom for future generations. Give today at hslda.org/donate. That's hslda.org/donate. Thanks for listening to this episode of Homeschool Talks. If you've enjoyed this conversation, will you do us a favor by sharing it with a friend or leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts? As a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode along with our other Homeschool Talks conversations at hslda.org/podcast. And if you want to be the first to know about new episodes, as well as upcoming guests and topics, you can sign up for our email list using the link in the show notes. That's all for now. We hope you enjoyed this program, and we'll see you next time.